Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone. It being the allotted hour, I'll declare this meeting open. I'd like to acknowledge the past and present traditional owners of the land on which we gather to conduct this meeting and pay respects to their elders, both past and present. Item 2 is attendances and apologies. One of the officers, Mr. Phil Adams, is an apology. Are there any other apologies? Not that I can see. Okay. Councillors, do we have any declarations of interest on any item on the agenda tonight? Okay. Announcements. I don't have any announcements tonight. At the request of a community member, I am going to go to public question time. Now, we allocate 15 minutes to public question time. Generally, residents or anyone is permitted to ask 2 questions. Then I'll ask you to sit down and we move on to the next person to ask 2 questions. And if we have time or if councillors wish to extend public question time, we will continue asking questions around the room. So at this point in time, I'd ask if any members of the community would like to ask a public question. Raise your hand if you do. Mrs. Brinkworth, if you'd like to come to the microphone.
I don't really know whether mine's a question or statement.
I've gone to questions first off. Okay. I'm going to questions straight afterwards anyway, if you like.
Okay. Let's do it now?
Yes. You wanted to do questions or statements?
Both together.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Good evening. I'm Anne Brinkworth, 19 Ida Street, Bassendean. I just want to speak about item 9.5. I and many seniors are very disappointed and concerned with the results and recommendations of this review. We were notified of the intent, but none of us were given any input whatsoever. On page 43 of 71, there is mention of a new offence of industrial manslaughter that may cause death. This is scary stuff. Maybe we should get rid of all our volunteers completely. Risks are identified that are in everyday life, and none of us would be able to function, especially seniors. We have worked all our lives, and we just need to go shopping and medical appointments. Taxis are not an option, as I recently, just 2 weeks ago, had to wait 3 hours outside the shopping centre to return home in the dark. I query that some of the office don't have conflicts of interest, but my view, may have some impact on their positions.
Ms. Brinkworth, I think that would be speculation, so okay, I'd ask...
I said I query.
Yep, I would ask that we perhaps... you certainly are entitled to an opinion, but if we can avoid speculating on motives and what have you, that would be appreciated very much.
The reason I've said that, Madam Mayor...
I don't think we should be going into those. I think what we need to do is talk about the report. Okay. Thank you very much.
But I won't leave that one. I ask this council to defer this item until June 2023, before the 23-24 budget, so that we can have community input into options that are available. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Brinkworth. So I'll take that as a statement. Sorry, I actually brought question time forward because of one person who said they had to leave early, but I actually can't see them in the room. So on that note,
Make a statement.
I'll just ask,
I do have some questions.
you have a question?
Some questions.
Some questions, okay. If you would wait, we'll go to the statement from this lady. So I changed it around for one person who doesn't appear to be here now. So, ma'am, if you'd like to come to the microphones.
May I just sit here?
It's for the microphone so that we can actually record it. So if you could state your name and address, that would be excellent.
My name's Jill Hind. I'm a resident of the Hyde Retirement Village. And I'd like to say we didn't receive any of the proposals. None of us have seen it at all. So you were lucky to even get a copy. But the aged residents in an aged retirement home had no input whatsoever. I'm lucky I don't need to use the services, but a lot of my friends do. And I don't see why we weren't informed.
Thank you. Did you want to? Statement. We'll take that as a statement, ma'am.
One more. I haven't, of course, read that proposal, even though I feel I should have done. I live in a retirement village. But if you're concerned about insurance, what about a waiver for the residents who might use the transport?
Thank you for that.
That's all.
Are we still on statement time?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Carol Solomon from 55 Broadway, Bassendean. On the matter of community transport, it's my understanding that this service has been provided by volunteers since about 1983. The service takes people as per the rule, to doctor appointments, and I understand also shopping. Everyone must be able to walk to the car. People in wheelchairs use government-provided equipped taxi services to assist people in wheelchairs. To assume that family members can take over from this valuable service that our volunteers provide is short-sighted. This puts even more strain on family members in this current economic crisis of skills shortage. The benefits of having a regular volunteer rocking up to assist an elderly member of our community is ensuring that they have social interaction and a sense of well-being within the community. To consider that the service that our volunteer transport service provides should remain and not be abandoned and still operate within the current guidelines to meet the new government requirements. Okay? On the resolution of council, I feel that councillors have the responsibility to decide when resolutions of council should be removed.
So that's, sorry, Ms Seidel, can I just, is that's item 9.7 you're referring to now? Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That ensures ratepayers and sitting councillors to search for resolutions to discover that resolutions that have been removed by staff who have not been elected as ratepayers is not acceptable. On the verge one, which is 11.1, I was shocked. I was shocked to find that the verge pickup had been cancelled this year, and the thought of myself requesting a skip in to pick up maybe 4 or 5 items is extremely costly. I like the idea of having a valet pickup. That way the locals in the area get to save discarded items from landfill. My estimate is that when people put stuff out on the verge, there was a large, considerable amount of items removed, being reused and not end up in waste. Good for the planet and good as well for us. Going on the idea that we have 8 units on a block, which I think is in second Ave, and having 8 occupiers requesting a skip in each is uneconomical and costly to the town. Under what is being proposed, this motion that's being put up seems to me more sensible than what has been offered by the town to ratepayers now. Thank you.
Ms Seidel, on that last, sorry, I will leave that till afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any more statements from people in the audience at the moment?
Mayor, I'm also requesting questions before statements because the answers to the questions may inform my statement.
Okay.
So if I were to ask some questions, could I have a sneaky statement afterwards?
I will allow that.
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if there's no more statements, I will move on to question time, public question time. As I said before, usually 2 questions per person, and then we move on to the next person, but we can allow more if time permits. So if you could raise your hand if you'd like, if you'd come to the microphone, Ben. Mr. Wood, sorry.
Ben Woodward, 77 Whitfield Street, Bassendean. My questions are pertaining to item number 9.3, specifically the evaluation report that councillors are being asked to base their decision on when considering the future of the pedestrian-only zone on Old Perth Road. The report, as it's presented in the attachments, is very light on hard data. It's predominantly survey feedback, and I'm not sure who the staff member may be who could answer some questions about some data or information that may be out there but was not included in the report.
Yep.
So, for example, in relation to foot traffic, was the amount of foot traffic measured before, during, and after the power to the people activation? The amount of foot traffic on the northern side of Old Perth Road.
Madam Mayor, if you don't mind, I can actually take that question on notice, or I can pull up some of the additional data that may be related to these questions, because the attachment that was provided as part of the report was primarily the raw data from the survey results from the surveys that were conducted during the trial and the following Survey Monkey result afterwards. So if you have specific data that you'd like me to retrieve, I can have a look at that for you.
Yeah, I could list it. So that one about the amount of foot traffic before, during, and after. Also, if perhaps before there was any study of the average amount of time that someone spent in that section of Old Perth Road versus after the activation. Also, if there was any survey or information about perhaps how many businesses an individual may have visited per visit to that section of Old Perth Road before the activation versus during and after. My other questions are about whether there's any information about parking. Obviously, anyone who would formerly have parked on that section of Old Perth Road would have had to find alternative parking, which means that cars would have been redistributed around the town, either to car parks or nearby streets. So I'd be wondering if there was any study in how that redistribution worked and whether it would be amenable to a future pedestrian-only zone. And also, I know this is a lot of questions, Mayor, and also with regards to that redistribution of parking, conceivably that could have knock-on effects for residents in surrounding streets. And I wondered if residents in surrounding streets had been canvassed in any way to receive any information from them about whether or not it had any effect on them.
Through you, Madam Mayor, in respect to the car parking, I can answer that one now. The town didn't undertake any formal counts in terms of the occupancy of the bays on adjacent streets before, during, or after the survey. As part of the review of the parking local law, when that was last undertaken, the town determined that it would do a survey of the town centre car parking to look at occupancy of bays as part of that. And that's something that anecdotally we've reviewed some of the feedback received through the survey in respect to the use of those bays. But our intention, should council retain the space as is, would be to actually look at potentially introducing parking restrictions on adjacent side streets if it was considered to be an issue following the retention of the activation.
I'm aware other people may have some questions, but if they don't and we've still got our 15 minutes.
how about I ask you to sit down for a moment and I'll just check if anybody else would like to ask questions. Would anybody else in the audience, yes ma'am, if you'd like to come to the microphone, give us your name and address and ask your questions.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Anna Moganathan, and I am a resident of Bassendean 7A Hardy Road. And I will be talking about, or asking questions, plus maybe a little statement, about the point 9.2, which talks about lot 35, Hardy Road, currently occupied as a short stay accommodation. So that's on the page 19. So my question will be related to the, let me wear my glasses, getting older, to the objectives of the residential zone, which was quoted by the council and related to LPS 10, on which that lot 35 sits. As you probably know, and if everyone can read, we experience a lot of issues with the short stay accommodation in our area, including parties, shouting, screaming, smoking, and so on. We had to call police at some point. Receiving the report, we really appreciate time to look into that issue and making the recommendation, and we appreciate the recommendation very much. My question to the town is the objectives of residential zone. LPS 10 talks a lot about maintaining lifelong or long-time residents in the area, young families with the children, and that's what we actually have in our area. It's a quiet residential area, a lot of young families and some long-term residents, some of them living in the area of 40 years or 20 plus. So all these objectives are really fantastic and I love them. My question to the town is, how committed is the town to support those objectives and not changing plans to those kinds of objectives in terms of, for example, allowing short stay accommodation on the trial period. Why I'm saying about and asking that question, because if we keep and stick to these objectives and residential zone objectives, that will allow us residents to, for example, buy a house in those zones and understand that we can buy a house in a quiet area, and also helps the developers to buy investment property in an area where the short stay accommodation is allowed. So we're all having very clear view. So my question to the town is how you approach those residential zones plans and how committed you are.
So I will just ask the officer if we can get some responses to you as we go. So.
Thanks for your question. Through you, Madam Mayor, when an application comes in for a land use that isn't prescribed within our local planning scheme, such as short stay accommodation, the town's required to treat it as a use not listed. When we get an application for a use not listed, we're required to consider whether it doesn't comply with the objectives of the zone, may comply with the objectives, or does comply, and that determines land use permissibility. So in this instance, because the residential zone objectives includes a provision that limits, not bans, non-residential uses, it can be considered that it may be suitable for inclusion in the residential zone, subject to the amenity of the zone not being compromised. And so that provides the ability for the town to accept the application and run through the assessment process, including advertising. So that's why we've been able to take the application. In terms of whether it's approved by council, council is required to consider each individual development application once it's accepted on its merits. And so they need to consider all of the local planning framework, including the local planning policy and locational criteria, the objectives of the residential zone, that in addition to the one about limiting non-residential uses, and any submissions that have been received on the matter. So it's open to council to consider all of those elements and make a decision on whether it supports the application or not.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Sorry, did you put your hand up?
Jill, a statement and question again.
I'll just do questions at the moment. Do you have a question? So,
Is it a done deal with the town of Bassendean regarding the transport? Is it going to be stopped, or are you still having considerations?
okay, so this briefing session is not a decision-making forum. What a briefing session is a time for questions. So councillors, after we've done public question time and public statements and what have you, we then go on to the reports, and councillors can then ask the staff their questions. And from that, we then have a week to consider the responses, to potentially ask more questions. And then following Tuesday is a decision-making forum. So at this point in time, there is nothing in this report that is a predetermined decision. What we've got are officer recommendations. We're in a question asking forum at the moment, and basically decision making is next week.
So in that time, will you be speaking to the local residents? Will you get their input, like the residents from the Hyde Retirement Village and other elderly people who use the service? Or is it just going to be sorted out within the town itself?
Okay. I would encourage residents who have a point of view to convey that they may always contact their elected members to talk to us or to email us to convey your perspective. Do I believe that there will be extensive community engagement in the next week? Probably not. Can I preempt what might happen next week? No, I can't, because I am one vote amongst 7. So by all means, if you wish to talk to myself or other councillors, you are more than welcome in this coming week. But I don't believe there will be engagement from staff with residents in this coming week. No, okay. Thank you. It's question time at the moment. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Petra Richardson, business owner of Spotted 20 Old Perth Road. And my question is, has there been any surveying prior to the 2-week activation event and after about what people think about the closure of the street?
Okay, there was the Bassendean community engagement a couple of years ago now, extensive community engagement, and there was a significant amount of input about making that upper end of Old Perth Road more pedestrian friendly, to activate it and to have various things happening in that street. Subsequent to that, I would have to ask the staff if there's been any other engagement thereafter.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's outlined on page 29 in the report. There was no survey undertaken prior to commencing the activation. The only consultation that was undertaken was during the activation event, separately with individual business owners, and a survey following the event for the period outlined in the report.
Thank you. Now, we have actually gone past the 15-minute mark, so I would ask councillors if we've got Councillor McWilliam moving, Councillor Wilding seconding, anyone against? So we're extending question time. Resident, Mr.
Just to confuse things, I'll forego that question and make a statement somewhat based on your response to Petra's question about community consultation. Circling back to the evaluation report that's in front of councillors for them to be making a decision about the pedestrian-only zone trial, because that report is largely survey feedback, that survey feedback mirrors the Bassendean consultation, it mirrors the Town Centre Master Plan community engagement report. So the report that you have before you doesn't really have an added layer of information beyond what people want. The information that you don't have is whether or not it was successful. And so I would ask councillors, when considering the future of the pedestrian-only zone trial, that you don't weight that survey too heavily in your decision making. Also, if any councillors are considering continuing the pedestrian-only zone trial as it currently is in situ, can I ask that you pick a time you can be assured is peak pedestrian time on Old Perth Road, get up on the balcony of the Bassendean Hotel with a light refreshment, and spend an hour observing the space to see how, or indeed if, pedestrians are using and interacting with that space.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions? I do have a couple of questions that have been emailed in, so I'm just quickly going to read some of those. The first question is from Nonnie Jebbekinson. Who made the decision, this is in relation to 11.1, who made the decision for the town of Bassendean to adopt a skip bin on demand instead of the bulk verge collections, and why? The answer that I've got here is that the decision to adopt a skip bin on demand system was approved by the CEO under delegated authority. It was approved on the basis that it will meaningfully assist in achieving the targets in the council adopted strategic community plan and waste plan that is diverting 70% of material collected from landfill and reducing waste generated by 10% per capita. In addition, the skip bin service will reduce the illegal dumping and general amenity impacts associated with verge collection. In respect to the second question with a lengthy response, would you be able to email that? Thank you. In respect to Mr. Alex McKellar of 4th Avenue, Bassendean, this is in respect to item 9.1, use not listed. Thank you for the opportunity to make comment regarding the proposed short stay accommodation at 63 3rd Avenue, Bassendean, as well as hesitations around the management of commercial businesses in residential areas that I outlined in my feedback email. I am also doubtful about the ability of the owner management of the complex to follow through in their proposed limitations. A quick search of Airbnb clearly shows that the properties have a 2-night minimum, not 5 nights as stated in the proposal. How will the monitoring by the town be carried out? The answer to that is, should the town approve the application, the applicant will be required to comply with the conditions of development approval. And the onus is on the managers to maintain and manage that property according to those approval requirements. There is, again, a second question which I would ask that if that could be emailed out as well. Now, we've had an extensive array of questions mixed in with some statements there. I will finally ask if there are any more statements from the community before we move on. Okay, we'll now move on to deputations. Now we have a couple of deputations before us tonight. If you are providing a deputation, I would ask you to come to the front of the table and seat in front of the community members and state your name and the item number. I believe for this one is 9. Sorry? Lizzie, you're second.
Good evening.
So I think with deputations, we normally have 2 speakers.
And up to 5 seating.
Okay.
Good evening, councillors. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you on this very important issue regarding the future of Old Perth Road. My name is Petra Richardson. I operate Spotted on Old Perth Road, and I represent the many businesses affected by the Old Perth Road closure. We seek the immediate removal of the infrastructure and reopening of the road as a vehicle thoroughfare. This is essential for the ongoing operations of our business. These are the reasons why Old Perth Road needs to be reopened immediately. The current setup is low grade in presentation. It isn't in keeping with the surrounding businesses and does not fit the desired aesthetics that many in our community wish for. The pedestrian zone is detrimental to the businesses in this area. It prevents easy access to businesses, segregating the two sides of the street. The impractical, unattractive furniture is used only sparingly and mostly by smokers and vapors. The whole area is an unused eyesore. Both options 1 and 2, as per the conclusion in the agenda, to keep the street closed as is or as is and consider further activations, are not of benefit to the community and the businesses. To upgrade the zone to a standard that is both usable and attractive is expensive. This option has not been realistically budgeted for. Without continual and constant events to draw people to the zone and the support of alfresco dining from businesses that do not currently operate, it will not be utilised. As detailed in the agenda, events are expensive. The most supportive option for the economic development of the zone is to reopen the road. It is commented that the road carries 258 vehicles between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and only 21.5 vehicles per hour. To businesses along the affected strip, this is a significant amount of traffic. The road closure is potentially preventing over 200 customers from being able to easily access our businesses. We are all small businesses where every customer counts. Any losses, no matter how small, are felt. The closure has resulted in a lack of parking within close distances to the businesses. Parking remains the biggest issue and complaint amongst customers. The customers' feedback has been that if they can't find a park, they won't return. When the hotel is open, the hotel car park is full, and hotel patrons are also looking for and utilising other near parking spaces. Street parking is scarce and not always within easy walking distance to our businesses. The road closure has not resulted in a safer street. Cars have been seen driving down the wrong side of the road, turning right from Parker Street onto Old Perth Road on multiple occasions. Pedestrians are often seen walking down the road where vehicles travel, perhaps confused by event ahead signs and believe that both sides of the Old Perth Road are closed. Disability and delivery access has also been made difficult. It is evident the last 5 weeks of a poorly presented streetscape with no events management, unreliable statistics from questionnaires which were only surveyed during the festival events, and unrealistic future funding, that there are no benefits in the continuance of pedestrian zones either for the businesses or the community. The businesses directly impacted by this closure are here to tell you we do not want the closure to continue, and we do not do so, and if we do so, threatens our businesses and our livelihoods. The solution to these issues is simple. Reopen Old Perth Road immediately. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Petra. Now I'll invite councillors to ask questions. Councillors? Councillor McLennan.
Hello. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out this evening. And thanks Petra, I know it's hard to get up in front of everybody and to have you say, and obviously we are really grateful for you all being here and for all your business offers to the town centre. I've had the opportunity to talk to Petra during the week about your views about the long-term future of Old Perth Road, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the impression that your concerns about a pedestrian zone were particular to the current setup, but that you were open to exploring something that's more permanent and of a higher quality in the future. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, the last 5 weeks has proven to me that I don't think that as a small council we are capable of manning or financing that setup.
I'm not talking about events as such, I'm
Yes.
talking about in alignment with the town centre master plan, which has all sorts of components that would need to come together around businesses, development, pedestrian only street zones and so on. I was just interested whether your perspective on this as the current setup is distinct from a potential future redesign, I guess, of Old Perth Road with all those other factors coming together to support a more active town centre.
Sure. Look, I was open to the idea of it being restyled and presented more fittingly to fit the aesthetics with the community. Unfortunately, the current setup and a lack of attention to it being maintained over the last 5 weeks has diminished my vote to that direction. I would need severe convincing and planning that you would have the manpower, that you could employ a team of people to manage events that were consistently happening in the area to agree with that going forward.
So, if councillors don't mind, I wouldn't mind asking a follow-on question to that. And thank you all for coming. I have been in small business myself for 30 years, so I do know the trials and tribulations of running your own business. So, and I understand that every penny counts. So, thank you for coming. Following on from the questions from Councillor McLennan, I would ask, in the context of the Town Centre Master Plan, which I know that you're familiar with, Petra, there was an aspiration for high density development in along certain sites in Old Perth Road, an aspiration for increased population in the central district. Clearly, all of these things are a positive for businesses, local businesses in the area. Do you envisage a point in time where potentially there might be enough development and enough population in the town that a partial pedestrian only zone might actually be appropriate in that area? And I mean one that's done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In the future, maybe when we have several cafes and businesses open that do, as I said, there are none there to provide on our side of the road to provide the alfresco dining that adds the dimension to activate the street. So if we had 2 or 3 cafes and restaurants open along there that were happy to do alfresco dining, then that at that stage that might be a possibility to look at doing it. But at this stage in time, for our businesses to survive, we need to nurture what is already there, and we need the street open to survive.
Okay. I do myself have questions for the officers on this item later on when we go through the reports. But thank you for that. Councillors, are there other questions? Councillor McWilliam.
I hear you very, very well. Okay. So when we did the long table dinner, that was, I thought, very successful. Certainly enjoyed being part of that. And I know there are business owners here tonight who assisted with that. And we were very grateful for that. I'm sure that all the 65 people who were sitting down to have the meal were very, very impressed and delighted. It seems to me that it's not so much that event that is the cause of concern, maybe not even the Community Connect the following day, but really the 5 weeks since. Thank you.
Councillors, further questions?
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Plivka.
As the spokesperson for your group, can you provide any information on the effect on your trading figures over the 5 years?
Sure.
So 5 weeks.
The 5 weeks,
Tell me what 5
absolutely.
years.
I will openly say $20 turnover a day.
You would say was the cost to your business?
Yeah.
Personally?
That is what I've been turning over a day. No, sorry, the cost. Yeah, that has been my takings a day, $20.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The total tax, so that's not the reduction, that's taking.
Yes, yeah,
And presumably before that, were significantly lower.
yes, yeah.
In terms of your comment about if the street were to be closed,
Yes.
your expectation would be activation of the level that was seen during the REC activation.
Yes.
And obviously that comes at a large expense.
Absolutely.
Am I hearing that your fear is that the street is closed, there's no activation, no patrons? And
That's right.
That's the
Yeah.
scenario that you're concerned about?
Yeah, the last 5 weeks is the scenario that I'm concerned about.
In terms of the vehicular access, I mean, if there was some sort of traffic calming, so I suppose a compromise between, and I'm not suggesting I have a solution for this, but there's people that are there day in and day out. Would that work? You know, if it was safer for pedestrians, but still allow vehicles to move through that area?
If it was safer for pedestrians but would allow vehicles to move through there. So would our customers be able to potentially pull up for 5 minutes to run in to get the gift store or to run into the butcher?
Well, if there were such a solution that would accommodate that, would that be something that you would be interested in?
Could be a possibility if we were allowing the car traffic like that to be able to come into the area.
Yes, so
Then
they could still transit through there, but at maybe a much slower speed. So hopefully driving slower, people are safer, more of an opportunity to look at your businesses, and
Yes.
maybe everyone's happy.
So, sorry, is it like opening the road but at a lower speed or something you're talking about?
Look, I mean, if,
Councillors,
how that might be done, I couldn't
councillors,
say.
we're heading into a little bit of speculation there. I think that there are, I'm going to just say that there are multiple different ways that one can apply principles of pedestrian zones to streetscapes. I think that at this point in time, I don't think this is the forum to speculate on all of those variations of what could potentially happen at some point in the future. I think what we're here for in this report is to consider the existing streetscape and what's there at the moment, and dealing with that in its entirety at this point in time. So councillors, if you're asking questions, I think that we should, I did myself speculate about the future, but I think the actual layout of a streetscape in the future, I don't think we can speculate on that at this point in time. So
Yeah, well, I'm happy to leave it at that high level, and if it does come to that, we've got capable staff that could design such a solution.
any more questions, councillors? So thank you for coming. Really do appreciate your input. So, and we have another deputation from Lizzie Richardson.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, sorry, Lizzie, I'm freezing.
I guess big shoes to fill after going after Petra, but so I run the Bassendean markets. I have been doing that for about 5 years, 4.5 years. So myself and the Rotary run it together. The markets have been going for 14 years, and they were originally set up to revitalise Old Perth Road and that end specifically. We estimate that we bring about 25,000 people to the markets every year. That is by far the most regular event. It is the busiest event. Obviously, we don't have Australia Day anymore, so the busiest event. And these shops rely on the markets. Many of them have told me over the years, and past shop owners that aren't here anymore, that without the markets, that money is what gets them through winter. It's what gets them through those quiet days. It's that extra income knowing that they're going to have up to 2,000-3,000 people coming down to the street. They're customers that are just not there. So at the moment, we cannot return to the street unless that whole thing is cleared. I understand that in the future, like, we need to do something. Something needs to change, and it'd be interesting to see what the plan would be. But at the moment, the markets will not be returning to the street if it's there. we can't get our food trucks in, we can't get the cars in. When we have 70 stall holders, that's about 200 vehicles that need to enter the markets every day, plus set up and have their marquees, their generators, their food trucks, all of that. It's a logistical nightmare as it is with all the curbs and the poles and the trees and stall holders, but having half the road blocked off, we would be losing over 50% of our stall holders. These markets aren't a money-making market. Most of us are doing it as a bit of a volunteer kind of role. We would need to get a significant grant to be able to continue or move locations. But the problem is there's no real other locations that we can do a winter event because the parks flood. We're on a swamp here. You know, everything just gets soggy and food trucks would rip up any park that's pretty much around in winter. And the whole point was to be on Old Perth Road supporting the shops. We were quite surprised, to be honest, when we seen that 46% of the people surveyed had said, yes, keep it the same. It's quite unfair because I think 46% of those people saying that have just had this amazing event. Like they had all this free activities and ice creams and petting zoos and all these things, which were incredible. You know, I've got kids, they loved it, but those people really, I don't think they've thought about what's going to happen when all that money's gone. And we don't have that money to be running events like this. I wish we did, but we don't. So people as well had said it was going to support the markets and, you know, have all these food trucks and things, but those figures just aren't realistic of what event organisers need and what shops need. So I guess we're in the situation, I'm at the situation now where I've got stall holders not wanting to book the markets because they don't know if we're going to be there. Are we going to have this mini event? We'd normally have, you know, 70 to 100 stall holders. Are we only going to be able to have 35? If so, we're going to get picked apart because they won't want to attend. They'll go to other events because markets rely on that vibe of having all the other stall holders there and all the people, but we'll end up like a Midland Farmers Market. We'll slowly get picked off if we are forced to reduce in size. The market's road closure at the moment, to do 5 morning markets costs nearly $10,000 in traffic management fees. We don't even break even for our morning markets. The night markets are purely funding those morning markets. So I don't know how in the future, how this is designed, how we're still logistically going to be able to get everyone in there. And I kind of need to know very soon, ideally at your next meeting, if you guys are going to be removing this stuff, because I'm trying to sell an event to people to buy, you know, their sites, but I can't even promise them where we're going to be. I don't know if we're even going to be in Bassendean. You know, there's other councils that would be happy to take the Bassendean markets and merge that into their events that are struggling. But if we can't be on the road, I just don't know what we'll do. And we can't go to the park because it is swampy. Over the years, the Rotary, who couldn't be here tonight, but they've mentioned from the Bassendean markets and formerly Old Perth Road, they've made over $250,000 doing their sausage sizzle and from their stall fees and payments from being at the markets. 10,000 of that was given to the Ashfield Can to create the Gary Blanche Reserve, and 17,000 was also donated to purchase right car for the town. So these markets are not just about putting something on, they're connecting the community, they're bringing people together, and they're also putting money back into the community. So there's just so many things that would be lost if we can't continue here. I do believe that until a solid plan has come up and we've, you know, all voted and it's funded and it's ready to go and you're ready to break ground, that everything should be removed and we should just continue on and see what you come up with, I guess. But at the moment, please get rid of all that stuff.
Thank you. Can I just ask if we can close the windows because of the noise that's commencing? There's a few windows open, Bryce. So thank you for that, Lizzie. Now I'll open it to councillors to ask questions. So councillors, do we have questions of Lizzie? Councillor Politica?
Not preempting the outcome next week, but if all that material were to be removed, how soon would it be before we would see the full-scale markets in that location?
So our markets, our morning markets, run from from May till September up on the road, right. And then we go October down to April down at Big Reserve.
So a decision would have to be made prior to May or many months in advance?
If we don't have a decision probably in the next month, then I will be looking at moving the markets to a different suburb or a council, unless I can come up with a concrete hard location here that's flat. Unfortunately, the rest of the street, there's potentially down that bottom of the street, but you can't put food trucks and things like that on hills, and Bassendean is very hilly.
No, the markets are invaluable. It's just good to
Yeah.
understand the consequence of the decision.
I can't be selling an event to someone if I don't even know where it's going to be. And yeah, probably in the next month, I would need to have a solid, yes, you can be there, or no, skedaddle.
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Further questions, councillors? No, I think you covered that very
good. That was very unorganised.
So, thank you, Lizzie. As I said, there are questions from councillors of the officers shortly. Okay, so that concludes deputations. We have some nice music to keep us going. So, councillors, we'll move on to reports. We have 9.1, use not listed, short stay accommodation, units 1 to 8, 63 3rd Avenue. And I would ask if Ms Shaw will speak to this item.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The application is for short stay accommodation for all 8 multiple dwellings at 63 3rd Avenue in Bassendean. Local planning policy short stay accommodation was adopted by council at its October meeting. During the consultation period, the applicant contacted the town to advise that they had been operating short stay accommodation, unaware that development approval was required. An application was then lodged as detailed in the report. The proposal does not comply with all of the requirements of the policy, in particular the locational criteria, given the site is beyond the 400 metres which was adopted by council, the 400 metres being from a centre or railway station. During the consultation period, the town received 12 submissions, 9 objecting to the proposal and 3 providing comment. The concerns that were detailed in the submissions are primarily related to crime, car parking, noise, and the ability of the applicant to manage the accommodation. The applicant has submitted a comprehensive management plan with the application, which includes 3 property managers, the use of third-party security and noise monitoring devices. And as such, the town considers that the proposal has the potential to be appropriately managed, which addresses some of the requirements within the policy in relation to the impacts on amenity and some of the concerns that were raised during the consultation period. On this basis, the town has recommended temporary approval, which will enable the town time to manage the development over a 12-month period. Minor modifications would be required to the management plan that was submitted as detailed in condition number 6 of the report, should council approve the application on a temporary basis. I note that it's also open for council to refuse the application or to approve it not on a temporary basis.
Councillor McLennan.
Thank you for that. If council was to not approve this, how much weight would our adopted policy that seeks to limit short stay accommodation within 400 metres of the town centre have if the applicant was to appeal into SAT?
Thank you through you, Madam Mayor. Local planning policies are a relevant planning consideration that SAT would need to have regard to in considering any application for review. What would likely happen is SAT would ask the applicant to address any potential amenity impacts and request that the town provide more justification as to the basis of the 400 metres. Council would then likely be invited to reconsider its decision based on any further information provided by the applicant.
Okay, and sorry. Obviously, we've got 2 items on tonight's agenda to do with short stay accommodation, and the second one, the office recommendation, is to refuse. And I understand it's in a different location and there have been complaints about it. Are they the main 2 differences for why this one is being recommended for approval and the other one's not?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it mainly relates to the detail that's provided within the management plan, because as I outlined during public question time, for the town to be able to even accept these applications given their use not listed, we need to be satisfied that there is a potential to address any amenity considerations that may occur as a result of them being approved. The management plan that was submitted in support of this application provided almost backstops to the managers not being able to address the issues by way of third party and the noise monitoring devices, whereas the application for 5B Hardy Road primarily resolved in relating on the applicant themselves, either responding to issues when they're addressed by neighbouring property owners or on a complaints basis to the town. So the town was of the opinion that with the 63 3rd Avenue application, it was more likely that the applicant could manage the facility to address any potential amenity impacts, less so with 5B Hardy Road.
Thank you. And just last question, there was a question from Alex McKellar, I think, from the community around this property still being listed on Airbnb, and potentially there being some conflict between the timeframes that it's listed for compared to the recommendation report. Should it still be listed, and is that the kind of thing that the town would monitor to ensure that it was being compliant with the requirements of any approval?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it should not be listed. In terms of compliance action, the approach that we typically take when we become aware of this is to write to the landowner and ask them to cease operating until such time they have a decision on the application. There is a bit of leeway once an application has been lodged because we're going through the assessment process, in the sense that it's likely that we will have a decision whether it's approved or not ahead of when potential prosecution action could be commenced and finalised. If in the event council resolves to refuse the application, we would be directing the applicant to cease operating and to remove it from the platform. But with the refusal, we would have the ability to take enforcement action in the event that that didn't occur.
Councillor Carter.
Oh, thank you. To you again, Ms. Shaw. Given that both of these were operating without approvals, and one of them for quite some time, do we know, are there other short stay accommodations in the town that do not have approval? Are we aware of them? Have we any idea of the figure? And what is it we can do about them? Sorry about the double-barreled questions.
Okay. Through you, Madam Mayor, from time to time, the town's planning staff will review the platforms to see if there are any listings that we're not aware of. But given we don't have a dedicated compliance team, we typically act on a complaints basis.
And you don't have any idea how many there are in the town based on this?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not at this point in time, but I can try and find out. I note that some are listed on platforms, some are privately operated, some go through social media to seek guests, so it is difficult to monitor. And in some instances, we request the landowners to cease operating. They'll take it down from the platform and then relist it a few weeks later. So it is an ongoing issue.
Okay. And I have one more question. Is the approval, if we approve particularly the one in 3rd Avenue, would that set a precedent that others would then be able to point to?
Through you, Madam Mayor, no. All applications need to be considered on their individual merits. It's a quasi-judicial decision of council, so there is no precedent that can be set. If a future application is lodged, we would consider it against the requirements of the local planning policy and the applicable local planning framework.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Plivka.
So there's 8 units on the one residential lot, and that's more than 400 kilometres from, 400 metres from a, in my orders of magnitude wrong, that's 400 metres from a train station. So presumably people are getting there by motor vehicle?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, that's correct. And within the report, I've actually undertaken an assessment as if the units were actually used for permanent accommodation, so if they were a typical rental or if they were owner occupied. At the time that this particular development was approved, being the multiple dwellings, the version of the residential design codes that was used to assess the minimum amount of car parking required for the development was actually more onerous than what you would actually have now. So if this application was approved now, given the locations within 800 metres of the train station, you would only need to provide 1 car parking bay. So given they've provided 13 on the site, they actually have more than what they would need as if it was approved as multiple dwellings. But we've undertaken the comparison for car parking on the assumption that it is the short stay accommodation as provided in the local planning policy for car parking.
In that regard, so it accommodates people on a short-term basis and their motor vehicles. There's 8 of them on one residential lot. How is it not a motel?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there are different land use definitions and what constitutes a motel. So, for example, we originally looked to see whether it was a hotel, but the definition includes requiring a host to actually be there and welcome guests. Motel accommodation, it's hosted. It is an unhosted accommodation, whereas a motel, similar to a hotel, would require an administrator to actually be there to welcome and receive guests.
So in some respects, a motel is a better usage because there's on-site supervision.
Through you, Madam Mayor, arguably yes, but we need to consider what they've applied for.
Yeah. Thank you.
Councillor McLennan?
Bryce has left the room. This isn't so much to inform our decision, but I was just interested in the comment about the waste management plan. It said that the property owner is currently on the former to-be system. I was just interested to know how we've got properties that are in residential areas still on the to-be system.
Through Madam Mayor, I can't speak as to why there would still be properties, but this one I believe was changing over in the following week. So at the time of writing this report, it was on the old system, but either now or in the next few weeks, it would be on the new system.
I imagine though that's only been brought to our attention because of this application.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe multiple unit developments, not all of them are on the 3-bin system and they're only recently being changed over.
Thank you.
Councillor Ames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you to Shaw, or anyone else wants to answer my question. Is the town looking to put together a template for this type of application to come through so that, you know, there's some pretty decent information that's coming from these applicants that we can almost just go tick and flick and they really have an understanding about what's expected of their submission instead of having it to bring to council on a number of occasions? Because we've been through these a few times and they're vast in their information capacity. So I just wanted to find out if the town's looking to do something like that so we can have that in a bit more templated way for our community.
Through you, Madam Mayor, so within the local planning policy that was adopted by council and within the draft position statement from the state government, it includes details of what should be included within a management plan, but it doesn't actually include a template. In terms of the town drafting a model template, we can't seem to be effectively deciding for an applicant what they should include or what measures we would be prepared to accept. And the reason being is that we are impartial decision makers and we need to consider each application on its merits. So whilst we can provide guidance in terms of high level things that should be included, such as property managers' details, we can't specify what would be an acceptable management measure. So for example, we can't specify noise monitoring devices as part of a management plan. Because we have to consider each one individually on its merits. It would be open for council to set the parameters as per the local planning policy, which it has done, and then provide delegation to officers to assess them. The reason that the short stay accommodation proposals need to come back to council is because they're currently a use not listed because they're not a land use in the scheme. Once council gets to the point of having an adopted new local planning scheme number 11, the various short stay accommodation land uses such as hosted and unhosted accommodation, holiday homes, etc., are all included within that, and council at that point in time will be able to provide a delegation on whether it wants to have these applications considered by council.
Yeah, thanks, Shaw.
Councillors, any further questions on this one? Okay, we'll move to 9.2, which is also a use not listed, short stay accommodation, 5B, lot 35, Hardy Road, Bassendean. Again, I'll defer to Ms Shaw to provide an overview on this one.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the application is again for short stay accommodation, this time for a single house at 5B Hardy Road in Bassendean. In this instance, the town received a complaint regarding the use of the property for short stay accommodation, following which the town investigated the matter and requested that the landowner lodge an application for development approval, which has since occurred and is detailed in the report. The site is beyond the 400-metre requirement to a centre or railway station contained within the short stay accommodation local planning policy. During the consultation period, 7 submissions were received, 3 objecting to the proposal, 1 providing support and comments, and 3 providing just comments. Similar to the other application, the concerns related to car parking and noise and the ability to manage the accommodation. In respect to managing the property, the applicant proposes to ban house parties, restrict visitors other than guests, use CCTV, and provide the contact details of the landowner to nearby properties. Despite these measures, the town considers that given the landowner is the only listed manager for the property and management relies on a complaints basis, there is concern that the amenity of surrounding property owners may be adversely impacted should the landowner be unable to respond to complaints in a timely manner. As such, the town has recommended refusal for the application. However, it is open to council to also resolve for a trial period for a 12-month period to enable the town to monitor the management of the development.
Okay, councillors, questions? Okay, we will move on.
I'll have a quick question, Madam Mayor.
Councillor Ames.
You might not be able to answer this and through you to Shaw. As Councillor Carter was saying, we've got a few of these establishments that have been under the radar for a period of time and only come up because of complaint scenarios. Are we able to, just for our own knowledge, find out, obviously they're not approved for short stay, so they don't have a guest register, for example, that needs to be provided to the town. Are we able to get some of that prehistoric information from those residents or from those establishments to find out what's been going on for the past X number of months or years to maybe aid them in or maybe deter them from an approval for their application moving forward? If you understand what I'm asking about.
Through you, Madam Mayor, we would never deter somebody from making an application because we consider them all on their individual merits. But in terms of the historical use of short stay accommodation, some of the listings include how many stays have been booked in the past.
Yep.
So we can go through and look on the listing, but that's only if the platform provides that information.
No, sorry, it's only this part of the meeting is for councillors to ask questions. Sorry about that. So, councillors, any further questions on this item?
Point of order, we could, residents are able to ring or get in touch with individual councillors outside this meeting.
Yes,
of course.
yes.
So
I did indicate that earlier during the meeting. If you would like to contact any of your elected members around the table during the week, you're more than welcome to do that. Our contact details are all on our website, and I actually gave you my business card, my councillor card earlier in the meeting before it started. So please do contact me or my fellow councillors to have a discussion or to even just send in your comments if you like. Also, next week's meeting, again, we have public question time, we have public statements at the beginning of the meeting as well. Okay. Sorry, councillors, I just went ahead of myself. Okay, councillors, and we will now move to 9.3, which is the evaluation of the pedestrian zone trial. And I will again ask Ms. Shaw to provide a short overview.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is to present to council the results of the community and business surveys following the recent trial of the pedestrian-only zone at the western end of Old Perth Road. The trial of the pedestrian-only zone was identified within the adopted Bassendean Town Centre Master Plan, and the town successfully received funding as part of the RAC Reconnect program for the trial and activation of the space during late September to early October. A series of activations and events were held during the trial period. As demonstrated in the report, whilst there was broad support from the community for the pedestrian zone, the need for ongoing activation of the space was identified. Businesses on or adjacent the zone favoured reopening the road, with the need for ease of access to shops and parking bays identified. It is open to council to either retain the zone in its current form, retain with future activations, or remove the infrastructure and reopen the road to traffic. So as you can see with the recommendation there, the officers haven't provided a specific recommendation. It will be open to council to consider any one of those options.
Thank you. Councillors, I have Councillor Ames followed by Councillor McWilliam.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you, can you just repeat what those three options are at the end? Can be sure, just for
thank you. Yep. So it's open to council to either retain the zone in its current form, retain with future activations and change the specifications of the road, or remove the infrastructure in its entirety and reopen the road for traffic.
Fantastic. And to follow on that question, if we were to decide that next week, how quickly could the infrastructure be removed from the road that is currently placed on Old Perth Road?
Thank you through you, Madam Mayor. We would need to use our internal works crew. They could be mobilised quite quickly. The only thing that may take a week or two would be traffic management.
Councillor McWilliam.
Through Madam Mayor, I'm just wondering, in terms of the survey and the number of people who really came online to actually put in their views, which was a significant number of people. I'm a little bit surprised at how many. Is it a matter of course that we record the IPS addresses of people putting in survey answers online?
No.
And would we be able to tell if a number of people are putting in lots of survey returns?
Yeah, if I can, Madam Mayor, I can take that question on notice and liaise with our communications officer.
Thank you.
Further questions, councillors? Councillor Carter.
Just a quick one. Thank you. Probably to anyone. If we do decide to remove all that infrastructure, there's nothing stopping us closing it for particular events, is there, in the future for short-term purposes, is there?
No.
No. Yes, no. Thank you.
Councillor Ames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you. If we've had some pretty strong feedback from the community today, and there's obviously a lot of information to get through, is the earliest that we can remove the infrastructure that's currently in place after a decision made next week? Or are we able to remove a portion of it or some of it tomorrow morning?
Through Madam Mayor. Through Madam Mayor, as was always mapped out as part of this project, this was a project that was proposed by a number of councillors as its genesis. The proposal was to trial the closure, and it was always intended and conveyed to council that the results of the closure and the results of the trial would be brought back to this very room for a decision by the elected members as to the future or otherwise of the trial. To start removing infrastructure before council votes on the decision would be presumptive and would be inconsistent with the communications that we've released all the way through this project. So, I mean, the short answer would be no, we'll wait for council's decision next Tuesday.
Councillor Polifka.
Going to the survey, we've had our local survey guru opine on the value of what's been done. In terms of the survey, was it put to people whether they would be interested in a closure without any activation whatsoever?
Through Madam Mayor, the survey was structured that it was gauging the view of the environment as distinct from the activations. I would suggest there would be at least some people who would have conflated the two. Yeah. That's, I imagine, only natural, but certainly the way the questions were delivered and the dialogue with the respondents was focusing on the physical environment as opposed to the activations which were occurring over the 2-week period.
Yeah, thank you.
So if you don't mind, I would like to ask a couple of questions. I did forward an email, I think, to yourself, Mr. Gibson, a couple of weeks ago about the potential of removing some of the infrastructure, the seating, and perhaps or inviting schools in the local area if they would like to take some of that seating. Has that idea been progressed in any way, shape or form?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not particularly. We do have processes under the Act about the disposition of property. Okay. So if it is council's decision to remove the infrastructure in line with some of the discussion that's occurred this evening, the town will assess the infrastructure in terms of its value and the most appropriate process for its disposal. If indeed it does dispose it, it may well be some of the infrastructure could be retained by the town and stored for other events or initiatives by the town or community groups from time to time.
What about the trees?
through you, Madam Mayor, the trees can be reused, replanted in other locations. Similarly, the soap wells, whilst they're painted, they're still quite functional. So there would be quite a bit of the material that could be reused for their original purpose. Obviously, the pallet furniture, the astroturf and that sort of thing is quite bespoke. So it may well be that we could dispose of it for a commercial sale, or we could dispose of it to not-for-profits or local schools, or similarly, as I said before, we could store it for future use. But that would be a matter to be considered depending on council's decision next Tuesday.
I've got a question, but I'm going to actually send that through in an email because I don't know that it's particularly 100% relevant to this agenda item as it's written. The last question I've got is in the expenses that were outlined. I was just curious about the inclusion of almost $6,000 for the Bassendean markets. Was that extra traffic management because they were split down to another section of Old Perth Road?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I do believe that was related to the traffic management, but can certainly double check and update councillors next Tuesday.
Okay. Okay, councillors. Actually, I will ask this question because you do have a paragraph on page 33 that indicates should council seek to retain the closure and redesign the road to a higher specification, i.e. flush curving, pavement treatings, plantings, etc. The cost of design and community consultation and construction is approximately 1.48 million. So I had a question about that in respect to the Town Centre Master Plan has an aspiration for higher density development in portions of Old Perth Road. Surely that development would generate developer contributions, would it not?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not necessarily, no. For it to generate developer contributions, council would need to formally initiate a developer contribution plan for the local planning scheme. As some councillors will have heard me talk about this matter before. I'll say again, as I said then, is developer contribution plans are exceptionally complicated. They require very slick infrastructure and accounting systems, and they also require council to effectively underwrite the value of the infrastructure in the event that the developer contributions are insufficient to cover the cost. So whilst it is something council could certainly consider, it's not to be assumed that we will have a developer contribution arrangement to fund these items of infrastructure. It's certainly open to council, but that will be a future decision.
Okay. No further questions, councillors? We'll move on to the next item. So we have item 9.4, which is parking amendment local law. And again, you're very popular tonight.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So as a result of Council's decision at its 27th of September council meeting,
thank you everyone for coming. So have a good night.
As a result of the decision at the 27th of September council meeting, where the council requested the Minister for Lands revoke the management order for the Wilson Street car park, there's a need to update the parking local law to remove reference to this land being a parking station. The town has identified some minor changes to provide clarification on other parking related matters, such as defining an electric vehicle and restricting the ability for non-electric vehicles to park in electric vehicle charging stations, as well as defining what constitutes the head of a cul-de-sac to prevent vehicles parking in these locations. We've also included some detail about where vehicles are considered to be an obstruction for the purposes of parking in a public place, such as a verge, and that relates to some provisions around removing those vehicles. It is recommended that council advertise the parking amendment in local law to capture these changes. An extended advertising period is recommended to reflect the Christmas closure period beyond the 42 days that would otherwise be required for advertising of a local law.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, do we have questions on this item? Councillor Polifka, followed by Councillor Ames.
Just on the definitions, and I can see why they're being put in place, because obviously you don't want people to park in spaces which are reserved for vehicles which need to charge. But just in terms of definition, so a Prius would not be an electric vehicle under the definition because it doesn't have that charging by being plugged into a power source. Was there some way we could, I suppose we talk about motor vehicles, but we do have vehicles that are electric that don't require charging. Right, look, I can see why it's been done, but is there some way of doing that otherwise to account for vehicles that do use electricity as their mode of power?
Through you, Madam Mayor, our ranger services are quite pragmatic in their application of the local law. I think it's safe to say they would probably use some common sense in enforcing the local law in that respect. So, you know, they would only be looking to impose penalties as contained in the parking local law if there was any issue where the owner of the vehicle did not move the vehicle on initial request, as opposed to simply parking it there in the first instance.
Yeah, because I was just thinking of practicality. When someone thinks they're doing the right thing, turns up in their Prius, it says electric vehicle parking, and then they find out that they don't have the apparatus which required that allowed them to park there. I'll leave it at that.
Councillor Ames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thanks for your question, Councillor Polifka. And through you, Madam Mayor, to Ms Shaw, with some of these changes that are happening, do you envisage any other lack of interpretation by our residents in other areas of the town that might involve changes of such nature just down in the Wilson Street car park?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor. Sorry, just for clarification, do you mean any other potential changes that we should include in the parking local law?
Yes, as well. Yeah, that one there, and also are these changes in local law going to affect any other areas in the town?
Yeah. Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. So the provision to remove Wilson Street parking station is designated as a parking station within the local law. So that's quite explicit. And there are no proposals to remove reference to other parking stations in the districts, because that's as a specific result of council's decision to relinquish that management order. In terms of the other definitions and interpretations, these are matters that we have been aware of just through day-to-day ranger service operations, where there have been instances where some residents may, for example, with the cul-de-sac head, they'd park too close to the bulb of the head, not realising that they couldn't park on it. So it's just to provide some clarification in that respect. We also reviewed a number of other recent local laws from other local governments to see if there were any other provisions that we should look at including, but I think the current local law, given it was reviewed in 2019, captured a lot of the requirements that we need to address.
So I have just one really minor question. Are we required to publish a notice in the West Australian, or could it be a local rag like the Perth Now?
Thank you. Yes, we are. It's a newspaper circulating the state.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for that.
One question. The local planning law, having a look at that, the status for verge parking. So my understanding from that is that unless there is a sign prohibiting that, people can park on verges which are not their own.
Through you, Madam Mayor, people can park on the road if it's not signposted otherwise, but there are a whole list of parameters within the parking local law around where you can park. So, for example, you can't be in a certain distance of a corner, of a fire hydrant, of the end of a cul-de-sac head. So it depends on the specific situation. But as I mentioned earlier, our ranger service will typically act on an education approach first and ask people to move if required on a safety, more so a safety basis. But yes, people can park on the thoroughfare.
But in terms of, the verge, adjacent, not the thoroughfare itself, the verge component, so off, you drive up the curb and onto land, of which they are not the registered proprietor, that's permitted unless there is a sign that says to the contrary?
Through you, Madam Mayor, they need the owner's permission to do so in writing. So as you may have experienced through the football day parking application, it was clarified through that process where yellow line marking was proposed on the road that there would be the opportunity for people to otherwise park on the verge if they had the owner's permission.
But always with the owner's permission.
Yes.
Obviously, we have examples of that which happen on a regular basis on a larger scale. So that would be something which is not permitted as such under the local planning law as it stands. To give context to that, in the vicinity of Sandy Beach, for example, would what's occurring there be something that falls foul of the local law, and should we be engaging with that explicitly as opposed to, I suppose, giving our rangers a discretion?
Through you, Madam Mayor, do you mind if I take that one on notice? I'll have a look into that, but it's not the planning laws that govern it, it's the town's parking local law.
Yes, yes.
Through you, Madam Mayor, if I can do something on that. The local law, the parking local law, which is not proposed to change in this respect, basically says a person shall not stop a vehicle on any portion of the verge, but that does not apply where that person is the owner or occupier of the abutting property or has the consent of the owner or occupier of the abutting property. So in terms of verge parking is able to continue where it's done with the permission, so to speak, of the abutting owner or occupier. In terms of the comment regarding West Road, we would need to determine, first of all, whether the parking is in the road reserve, whether it's in the road reserve or on private property. If it's in the road reserve, is it on the road or on the verge? And then if it's on the verge, if it's being done without the permission of the abutting owner, that would be an offence under the local law, under the existing local law, and under the proposed local law, which is not intended to change in that respect.
Yes, so there's a situation we're aware of which doesn't necessarily fit within our law. So we know that on a large scale there may be behaviour which isn't compliant with our law. So I suppose the question is, do we leave the law as it stands, or do we seek to engage with that and make I suppose, a positive decision as to what we want to do with something which we know is occurring? So I'm not suggesting a solution one way or the other, but just to engage with the issue. Is that something that's possible through this process, or is that maybe something that should occur at a later date in the context of a broader investigation of the adequacy of parking?
I would suggest through Madam Mayor the latter, just because the changes we've proposed at this point are fairly marginal, they're fairly immaterial in some ways. They follow on from other council decisions, or they're basically clarifying existing control we have in the local law. Changing the parameters around verge parking, potentially quite significantly, is probably a larger body of work that we need to really investigate before we propose a certain course of action.
Thank you.
Councillors, if we're finished with questions there, we'll move on to the next item, which is 9.5, Community Transport Service Review. So, thank you, Councillor McWilliam, for being so enthusiastic, but I will actually ask Ms. Shaw if she would like to provide a short overview first.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the Community Transport Service has been a valuable service to users and volunteers alike for nearly 40 years. The service relies on volunteers for administration and to transport residents to medical appointments, shopping trips and the like using 2 7-seater vehicles. Whilst the report identifies that 95 people are currently signed up to the service, since July 2022, there have been only 50 regular users due to some clients transitioning to other services. And just in response to some of the questions that were raised on the matter tonight in respect to contacting the users of that service, any user that has been registered since July this year, have been contacted individually to ask whether or not they have any other appropriate arrangements that they could use and whether they are signed up to the My Aged Care package to have access to other providers in that respect. We've managed to contact most of the users of the service. There are a few that are outstanding that we'll continue to try and contact throughout the week, but we have not contacted Hyde Retirement Village directly because we only contacted the people that were signed up as users of the service. As a result of the changes to work health and safety legislation, the town has undertaken a risk assessment of the service, which includes matters related to the training required for volunteers, the suitability of the vehicles, equipment, and the service delivery. The results of the assessment have identified that additional training, protective equipment, resources, and modifications to the vehicles are required for compliance with the legislation. The cost of risk mitigation have been itemised in the report. Given the current level of risk and financial implications to address this risk, the town reviewed alternatives to the service, as well as a comparison of other similar services offered by other local governments. The Commonwealth Home Support Program provides for community transport for residents that have been assessed under the My Aged Care program, with the majority of clients for the service already registered with My Aged Care. Given the penalties associated with non-compliance with the legislation, Council cannot continue the service as is and is required to either provide additional funding to provide for the risk mitigation measures or cease the service. Should funding be provided, the town would suspend the service until such time the risk mitigation measures have been implemented. Should Council cease providing the service, the town will liaise with the volunteers to redirect them to other volunteering opportunities and assist the existing clients to access other transport options such as My Aged Care. And as mentioned, that work has already been undertaken in the instance that Council does resolve to cease the service and there are urgent medical appointments that they would otherwise need to attend.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, questions? Councillor McWilliam first.
Through you to Ms Shaw, I suspect. So is this purely aimed at volunteer services, or is it something that's inclusive of volunteer services? So will taxi drivers and so on be subject to this, and Uber drivers, will they be subject to this?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I assume you're referring to the new work health safety legislation? Yes, they would. Yep.
Yeah. So can we expect to see a rise in cab charges as a result of them absorbing the cost and passing on in ancient form to customers?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that would be up to what risk mitigation measures, if any, are required for those particular services.
I guess too that it's important that we actually understand too what the opportunities are for our service providers. I've had a couple of people speak to me about this, who I know quite well and trust their views.
Questions? Make sure.
Yes, I'm getting to the question.
Sorry.
Yes, I have spoken to a couple of people who are very concerned about their ability to find an actually available option when their children no longer live in the area or even close by, that they would normally walk, but they don't want to walk when it's hot and they won't be doing that. Do they have to stay at home? Do they have to? All of these things are weighing on their minds, and in the meantime, we know that there are other service providers. How soon can we provide people with this information?
Through you, Madam Mayor, so as I mentioned, we've actually contacted or attempted to contact all of the people that are currently registered to use the service. I would say at least 80% of those have either provided their details for the My Aged Care program for the town's volunteers services to assist them in transitioning into another form of transport, or they've advised that they have either family arrangements or no longer actually need to utilise the service. In terms of the availability of some of the service providers already, we liaised with Armana to see whether or not they would be able to take on some clients at the moment. They've advised that they could, because they were aware that the risk assessment was being undertaken. The shopping trip with Armana would be $3 one way. We've also reached out to another organisation, which is People Who Care Transport. They've advised that they can provide transport for up to 10 existing clients in straight away, should council make this decision, with the cost of that being $5.50 one way for a 10-kilometre trip or $8.50 one way for 11 to 30 kilometres. So should council resolve to cease the service, or in the event that it seeks to provide the mitigation measures, but the service would be temporarily ceased, our volunteer services will certainly be liaising with other providers to ensure that the residents that are currently registered for the service do have alternative means of transport.
Councillor Wilding.
Thank you, Madam. I have a couple of questions. One's in a very similar vein to Councillor McWilliams around, we've obviously explored options for alternatives. Are we anticipating that by December 23rd we'd have options for everyone, or is there the potential that we'd be leaving people in the lurch over that sort of Christmas shutdown period where it might be more difficult to find alternative transport?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So it depends on the individual client. I actually have a spreadsheet in front of me for every individual client who's provided a response to date, and it ranges from, we have family that will provide assistance for us, or we're already registered with Armana, but we were choosing this service because this one is free or donation basis compared to paying for the service. So it depends on the individual clients, but as mentioned, we'll certainly be working with each of them.
Thank you. My second question is that the options presented in the report are pretty black and white, so have divestment, or we do that full investment to make it compliant. Is there any room in the middle for partnerships or sort of joint ventures in which another organisation can take on some of that core liability, but there is that connection maintained with the town and its volunteer base?
To you, Madam Mayor. So when we did the review of other local governments that are providing a similar service, as outlined in the report, a lot of them are larger and more equipped to be able to introduce mitigation measures immediately, but they were also operating through the My Aged Care program already. We did reach out to the City of Swan to see whether or not they could extend their transport service to capture the residents within Bassendean as well. Their service is actually under review as well, and will be presented to a council meeting similar to as what is occurring as this item. So until we have an understanding from them on whether they will continue their service, we wouldn't be able to determine whether they could expand it, but we can continue to liaise with them in the event that they keep their service and the town seeks to continue to provide a service.
One last question. Obviously other local governments aren't currently using that sort of partnering model. Is there any scope with not-for-profits for the town to pioneer some sort of partnership model with a relevant not-for-profit that utilises that My Aged Care and sort of takes on that liability, or is that a little bit too much?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think it would be similar to seniors and disability services, where once you start looking at those types of arrangements, you've divested from providing the service in the first instance anyway. Our service is effectively not-for-profit in the sense that it's largely operated by volunteers. So, yeah.
Councillor Carter.
Oh, thank you. I think this one goes to Mr. White. Given the figures that are given in the report, one, why do we need to have a new vehicle if the service is, as you say, not so heavily used? And secondly, why is the new vehicle having to have a modification for wheelchair hoist when we don't accept people in wheelchairs?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I can answer that one. So the lease on the vehicles is actually due in February in any instance. So we would be, should council continue with the service, we would be reviewing the vehicles anyway. In terms of the modification, the town did consider whether or not it only offered the service in its current format. But I think when we actually had a look at it in more detail, we needed to be mindful of anti-discrimination as well, and making sure that our services are available to all members of the community. But irrespective of clients who may be in a wheelchair using the facility, use of a hoist was considered an appropriate risk mitigation measure in the instance that there were other circumstances that it may be difficult for clients to access the vehicle. So it's not necessarily to do with the user themselves, but also the volunteers who may be assisting people into the vehicle.
Councillor Plivka.
Yeah, just to go through some figures. So on page 49,
Sorry, what page was that, Councillor?
we'll start on page, so this is of the actual report, the agenda for this evening. Page 48, I'm taking from there, so the net operating cost at present is 23,500. The way this is structured, we then say that if we want to continue in the new environment, excluding the one-off costs, because when 16,000 amortised over forever doesn't really matter, but 55,000 is the additional cost. So we add the 23,000 to that 55,000. So essentially, if we were to go down that path, we're looking at about 3 to 3.5 times the expense of what we currently incur for these services.
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes.
The other alternative you mentioned where there was distances for a fee, is the town able to directly engage that service provider, and if they were, and then say to the residents that are currently using this service that they can use this external service and that the town would pay for that? How much would that cost the town? So, and that would be using the projections on the usage for the past period, last year.
Through you, Madam Mayor, we could do that on the basis of what has been used in the past, but given the nature of the clients, sometimes they're using the service, sometimes they may be in hospital, sometimes they may rely on family members. It's not always consistent in terms of the trips that are taken, how many medical appointments they may have. So it would be difficult for the town to forecast what an appropriate budget allocation would be to support that type of arrangement. But in any instance, if it was to be operated by a third party anyway through My Aged Care, the programs through that would go through their home support package in any instance. So it would be a decision of council to, similar to City of Vincent allocating a nominal amount for first come, first serve for taxi vouchers. It would be open to council to consider whether it provides a nominal amount for X number of trips. But then the question would be, once that amount is used, how would we be able to continue providing that service?
But if we were to completely, so what we're doing now, plus the amendments that we're talking about, say we outsourced that to somebody else entirely, but the town was to continue to pay for it, and even overestimating the usage based on current usage, how much would the town need to pay that external service provider in order to maintain the level of service that the residents currently enjoy?
Through you, Madam Mayor, so we would need to probably do an analysis of past usage to get a better indication of that. But I understand the CEO, who was previously acting at the City of Vincent, could provide some insight into the operations there.
Thank you. That wasn't really my area at the time, but no, certainly it's open to council through its community funding policy to seek to supplement the cost, or subsidise the cost, sorry. As you can see on page 51, the City of Vincent does provide donations of sorts, which is prepaid taxi vouchers for $100 for individuals and $150 for couples. If that model, for example, was used here, and we have, I think, 90...
There's currently 48, so the 95 was, sorry, through you, Madam Mayor, the 95 that was listed in the report was pre-July, when the risk assessment and the review of the service in light of the legislative changes was first considered. So the actual amount of users at the moment, there are 6 drivers, 1 bus assistant, 6 receptionists and 48 users.
So if we said, thank you, Ms. Shaw, if we said 50 round numbers and said even doubled the City of Vincent, said $200 per person, it's effectively $10,000 to provide some funding assistance to those that would have otherwise enjoyed the town's community transport service. So that may be something council wants to consider in terms of a transition out plan to allow for, rather than being a direct service provider in a space that clearly is presenting an increased risk in light of the WHS legislation, it may be more appropriate that council seeks to support those particular residents via the council adopted community funding policy.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor McLennan, then I've got some questions.
Just on that proposal about
providing some funding to the existing users, and you just mentioned potentially as a transition out plan, which would be a slightly different scenario. I'm imagining that the people that currently use it have a variety of sort of financial means, and some of them will probably find contributions difficult, whereas others may well be able to afford that themselves. I'm just questioning how we make that determination about who would be eligible and who wouldn't. I'm just saying anybody who's currently using the service could potentially have vouchers from the town? Or?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that would be an option for council, and I suppose the question response is how do we currently get users now who effectively are paying a donation at their discretion, whether or not it's not means tested. So it would, whilst I understand Madam Deputy Mayor's comments, it probably wouldn't be a great deal different to the status quo in terms of applying one standard to all users irrespective of their needs.
And just following on from that, I can understand it potentially as a transition option, but we have other members of the community who may also benefit from this. Like I just have some concerns around how we would, if someone else then approached us wanting it, there'd be some equity issues then. So how would the town staff be able to deal with that if they were approached by somebody else?
Through you, Madam Mayor, probably with a degree of difficulty, and that is one of the reasons that hasn't been proposed. Obviously, the staff did a really good job in terms of the risk assessment and the environmental scan of other local government providers. City of Vincent is noted there on page 51. We do have an existing council adopted community funding policy, but for the reasons Madam Deputy Mayor sets out, it would be difficult to administer unless it was administered in a very bland way where all the current users are entitled to a flat figure, irrespective of their means, because that would not be a massive departure from the current situation.
And can I just ask, in regards to those current users who are eligible for my aged care, do they then have to pay for whatever transport services they're receiving, or is that something that's they're able to access for free as part of their package?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there is a small fee incurred with that. As mentioned before, for example, Armana, who is a provider of From My Aged Care, is shopping trip is $3 one way.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if they were my aged care recipients or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there's a paragraph on page 43 indicating that the WHS Act includes a new offence of industrial manslaughter with substantial penalties for PCBUs where a WHS duty causes the death of an individual in circumstances where the PCBU knew the conduct would cause death or serious harm. So I'm assuming it's under this particular provision that all of these assessments have been made. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not necessarily. That's just outlining the worst case offence that could occur. In terms of our assessment, you can see on page 53 under the statutory requirements, it establishes what we're required to do, which is effectively to eliminate risk to health and safety as far as reasonably practicable. And if we're not able to do so, to continue to minimise those risks. So effectively, because the town has undertaken this assessment and is aware of the risk, we're obliged under the legislation to make sure we introduce measures to mitigate the risk as far as reasonably practicable, or if we can't do that, to cease providing that service.
Okay, so this then comes to the type of service that can be provided by a local government to its community. And I would assume that as exists at the moment, that a service can be limited to certain parameters, like for instance, the current service does not permit collection of people in wheelchairs. There's a whole host of rules and regulations under the current service that people using the service must be able to walk to and from the vehicle and to be able to get in and out of the vehicle unassisted. Now, these are circumstances and conditions that existed for many years with this volunteer service. I'm not sure that I understand and perhaps you can explain this to me, why a council can't limit a service that they provide in respect to what they provide.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So in terms of it being operating in its current format, the town certainly recognises that it has been a valued service for nearly 40 years. The real change that's come about is the changes to the legislation and the requirements that we're required to adhere to. So they came into effect in March. Unfortunately, we can't ignore the legislation. We're required to adhere to it. So the only options that are available to council is to either provide the equipment and facilities and the funding necessary to mitigate the risk, or to cease the service.
Okay, I think what I was asking was if a service is limited to those who are able-bodied enough to walk to and from a vehicle, get in and out of a vehicle. My question is, why would that service then need to be, and I know that you've talked about anti-discrimination, but if a council is directing that a service only is provided to that group of people who are capable, I don't understand why anti-discrimination laws come into play there. And I'm trying to actually understand that, if you can explain that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It is open to council to make that decision. I wouldn't believe it would be appropriate to continue to discriminate against some portions of the community based on their ability to access a service. But in any instance, as outlined in the number of mitigation measures contained on page 49 of the report, a number of the factors don't necessarily relate to the ability to access the vehicles. They're things like first aid training, manual handling training, the ability to actually use GPS and track the vehicles. There are a range of matters beyond just the ability for the individual users to access the vehicle. So if council was to consider continuing the service, whilst it is open to them to limit the type of clients that can use the service, there are still a range of measures that would need to be introduced to mitigate the risk in accordance with the legislation.
Okay, so I'm going to go full circle to something that Councillor McWilliam opened with. Clearly, some taxi vouchers are available to clients. I think that's provided by the state government, I'm not sure. And I seek to understand how a taxi driver can provide that service and be paid under a voucher system from the state government and have all of these particular training and requirements. Like I'm just trying to understand how those particular drivers that cover a whole range of people of all different age groups and different education, and I'm trying to understand how do they get to provide that service and not necessarily have all of these upskillings that are required in this document.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So in terms of the access to the taxis, there are some specific taxis that provide for wheelchair accessibility, etc. But in terms of the implications of the legislation, as I said, the legislation came into effect in March. And so as with another of the other local governments that provide a similar service, they're undergoing review. So I think it's likely that in future, other providers will be undertaking such assessments to ensure that they're compliant with the legislation. It just happens that the town has undertaken this assessment at this point in time to be able to provide that advice to council.
I understand, Councillor Wilding. If you don't mind, just one more question. I do have so many questions, but again, you've just brought up a very interesting point, Ms. Shaw. You've indicated the taxi service provides some vehicles are equipped for wheelchair access, whereas the vast majority of taxis are not. So clearly the vast majority of taxis can pick up people who are able to walk to the vehicle and walk away from the vehicle, get in and get out. And those people who require a wheelchair can access a specific wheelchair taxi. They can also access some of the other services. So again, what I'm getting at is that there is a defined clientele for certain sections of even that very broad taxi service. And I would ask you, do all of those taxi drivers have to have all of this upskilling when they don't necessarily cater to people in wheelchairs?
Thank you. The town's undertaking a risk assessment against the service that it provides and hasn't provided a review against other services that may be provided by other agencies or West Australian taxis. But as mentioned in my last response, I would suspect that a number of these agencies would be undertaking assessments in light of the changes to the legislation moving forward.
Okay. Councillor Wilding, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to clarify some of the questions around the disability discrimination, would it be fair to say that the town services it currently operates has potentially been in breach of that Act for the duration of that Act, but it's just because a complaint hasn't been raised that it hasn't come to the town's attention?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that may be the case, but we also have an adopted disability access and inclusion plan. And part of that plan recognises that our services should be accessible by all members of our community. And so this decision would be in line with that adopted plan.
So it would be continuing with the current setup and saying that we don't accept, we put those limitations on, which might be a breach of the Act, would then potentially open us up to complaints in the future should we continue to operate under the same ground. And it's not because that particular legislation has changed, we've just become more aware of that risk as a result of this risk assessment.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, that is true and that is possible. As with any changes that occur from time to time, societal values change, what's considered acceptable changes over time, legislation changes, and it prompts the town to undertake these reviews and potentially change the nature of services that it offers.
Final question, and this might be speculative, so with regard to the taxi comparison, would it be fair to say that those taxi services, the Act requires a reasonable accommodation or alternative to be offered, and that reasonable accommodation is those alternative taxis which can take those people in wheelchairs, whereas the town, in its current setup, cannot offer an alternative thing, which makes it then potentially a breach.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the legislation just requires the town to assess the risk and mitigate the risk as far as reasonably practicable.
Sorry, with regard to disability discrimination, in terms of if there was a complaint in that regard, because we can't provide any alternative, whereas the taxi services can provide an alternative taxi that can fulfill that service.
I think that would be a fair assumption, yes. Mr. CEO?
Through Madam Mayor, the Equal Opportunity Act sets out what is discrimination on the grounds of impairment. And obviously that was from 1984, so that's not a new act. Obviously the new act is the Workplace Health and Safety legislation. In terms of the Equal Opportunity legislation, that's been around for many years. It is probably, as Councillor Whiting suggests, a case that there has been no particular trigger for action because there has been no aggrieved party, which is the term used in the legislation. But as Ms. Shaw suggests, the main trigger for the review was the Workplace Health and Safety legislation. While we were reviewing the service in its totality, it was appropriate to have regard to the Equal Opportunity Act as well as the town state.
I think Councillor Ames was possibly first.
Yeah, I'll throw a question there, and thank you, Madam Mayor, for noticing me.
You had to miss.
So
you had to miss.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The real major outlay of this additional, or to become compliant with the new workplace health and safety, is the additional part-time employee to manage the community transport operation. Is that not correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, in terms of financial implications, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, 37,492.
Yes, that is one component of the risk mitigation measures.
So the majority of the mitigation plan is through an employment of an individual, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. More of a statement, but I reckon it would be absolutely super which is very minimal expenses here, for volunteers to go through training of things like drug and alcohol policy, high-risk workers, first aid training, aggressive behaviour training, volunteer software training, which is awesome. But that would be a pretty good investment in our volunteers moving forward, that they might open to be utilise those skills in other areas of volunteering within our town if we were to invest in them with that minimal expense.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I think that would be appropriate in light of the type of work that they would potentially be undertaking. So, for example, in the interim, while this matter's been reviewed, we've liaised with a number of the volunteers to see whether they're partnering with the Red Cross to provide the telecross and telechat health services, which wouldn't require, for example, manual handling training, but may require them to have some sort of training in assertive communication to deal with potential issues that may arise through that process. So we would try and align any potential required training with the volunteering opportunity that that volunteer may like to engage in.
Sure. So then my final question is, this individual here that we need to employ for $37,492, which is the majority of the additional expense to become as compliant or as we need to be compliant with the risk mitigation items, what does this person have to do? Is there a person that's currently doing it, and cannot we offer that particular role to a number of volunteers to subsidise the cost?
Through you, Madam Mayor, they would need to have a Certificate 3 in aged care to provide the assistance that our volunteer services would require. None of the current staff have that certificate in aged care.
Sorry.
And can I ask why that new additional employee needs to have a Cert 3 in aged care if they are just managing operations rather than not actually maybe partaking in the volunteer service?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I mean, I would need to go through the individual units included within that certificate, but it's more around training on dealing with issues that may come about as a result of providing assistance with aged clients.
Councillor McWilliam?
It seems to me that we've been through something very similar in the not too distant past when insurance companies decided to become more risk averse unless you pay more money. Various entities in the town, including the town itself, had to put prices up or higher, etc., etc. I see this as another insurance instigation to actually put up the cost of insurances. I don't know if you agree with me, sure, but I think that certainly
Trying to get questions.
we would see more of the same in Victoria and South Wales with regards to building houses in floodplains. But in this particular instance, do you see this as being a possible instigation for the legislation?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we've considered this against the lens of the work health safety legislation and not potential increases to insurance costs.
If Councillor Plifka, then I've got one.
One small question which relates more to the implementation, so depending on which avenue we take. What I'm hearing though is that at present, the service, without these other things which will require time and money occurring, the service can't continue. So there would be without some supplementary avenue for providing these services, there would be a break in the services. So just to understand though, it's not an option for council, and it would presumably be unlawful for council to direct for business to continue as usual, and given that the liability under the Work Health and Safety Act would sit the administration side, and ultimately the buck would stop with the CEO. The CEO and administration having formed that view that it can't continue as business as usual, is it even possible for council to make a decision for business as usual, or is that unlawful?
Through you, Madam Mayor. I'm sorry.
Happy to take that, Councillor Plifka. Through you, Madam Mayor. The workplace health and safety legislation is quite clear. If you're a PCBU and you are convicted of industrial manslaughter, the penalty for an individual is up to $5 million and 20 years imprisonment. So if council was to make the decision that was neither one nor two, I as the CEO would not be implementing the third of two options on the basis that it would be contrary to the legislation.
So even despite our best intentions, there may well be a period where the services aren't provided. Not to say that in future they might not arise, but because we can't currently conduct them, there is that risk. So regardless of what decision we make, so people would need to be prepared for that eventuality, given what you've said that you would not be implementing that, you wouldn't be expected to do so.
Obviously, if I can add to that, through Madam Mayor, obviously the communication with those affected would occur immediately to ensure a soft transition as possible, but certainly council's decision was neither option one or two. as CEO, and therefore the head of the PCBU, we will be discontinuing the service either short term until such time as the mitigation is implemented, or in perpetuity.
Thank you.
I have a question first before. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in our current strategic community plan, there are several entries about increasing the rates of volunteerism in the town. Is that correct?
Do you, Madam Mayor? Yes, I understand that is correct. Yes.
Okay. So is there no pathway forward in this to attract more volunteers to this service, to have a soft transition period? I'm hearing that this is going to be curtailed at the end of this year, no matter what. And I would seek to have some solutions here where potentially we can transition a service that is valued by the community. Is there any option available to this council to look at a transition where we can adhere to our current strategic community plan, which is to increase volunteer rates, to retain a service that's valued, and to actually look at how we can service that section of the community? I'm interested.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the number of volunteers isn't the issue in this respect. As outlined in the risk mitigation measures, it's more to do with the training and the various pieces of equipment that would otherwise be required to mitigate risk. So the town certainly values the volunteers that have been operating this service for a long period of time. As mentioned earlier, we have been contacting the users of the service already to provide alternatives and to assist them into transition arrangements in respect to other providers. Those providers, if it's not My Aged Care, it's the other options or other providers that are outlined within the report. So it's not just Armanda that provides a service, for example, St John's and the People Who Care transport service. So there are a range of options. And it's a case of our volunteer services working individually with each of those clients to discuss what options may be suitable for them. In terms of the volunteering opportunities for the existing volunteers, noting that they wouldn't be able to continue delivering driver services or administrative support for the service, we'll be discussing options with them as to other volunteer arrangements that they may be interested in participating in, with the intention of hopefully retaining all of our volunteers, given they are so valued.
If you don't mind, I do have another question. I have long been interested in a service that started in Europe and has migrated all over the world and is currently in use. I think it's down in Coburn, and recently City of Swan, there is one that has started, which is like Cycles Without Age, I think. This is a service where dual cycles are used, volunteer bike riders take people who are aged or have disabilities on rides down to parks so they can feel the wind in their hair and what have you. This has been something I've long been interested in and been very aspirational about potentially starting a service like this in the town. However, would I be correct in assuming that what is being presented here in respect to this volunteers drivers service would in fact prevent the establishment of a service such as I've described in the town in the future?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would need to see the particular details of that service, and we would, if it is something that council's looking at implementing, we would run the risk lens over that as well in light of the legislation. And that's something that we'll be doing with all of our services, especially the frontline workers, but certainly for any new service that the town would be seeking to provide.
Sorry, councillors, are there any more questions? Okay, I think with that we will move on. It's 9.6 quarterly report. And yourself, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider the quarterly report for quarter 1, being the period ending the 30th of September. The report simply recommends the Council receives the report and endorses various resolutions for closure, noting, of course, the issue of management of Council resolutions is discussed in the next item on the agenda. I just want to bring Council's attention to a minor error in the attachment. So page 129 of 156, ROC 17 /53674 in relation to a proposed nursery, grow centre. The comment provided in the column on the right is incorrect. That will be corrected, updated during the week.
Thank you. Councillors, questions? Councillor McLennan.
Thank you. I just had a few questions really to get an update. On the bottom of page 8, it refers to annual assessment to transition the fleet to electric, and the comment is that it be considered as part of the 23-24 budget preparation. When we discussed this previously, there was mention of the fact that part of the consideration would be around the infrastructure required for those vehicles. So I'm just wondering whether that's intended to be included as part of that budget, or whether there's some action council needs to take for that to occur. I'm looking at you, I'm not sure.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe we've submitted an EOI as part of a WALGA project looking at electric vehicle charging within depots and facilities. So that would be considered as part of that project.
Thank you. There's also the Success Hill Drainage Project, and it mentions in here that WBAC was undertaking the groundwater monitoring and that we'd expect to have the results in November. Have we got any of those results yet? And do we have any sort of plan for how we can progress with this project at this stage?
Through Madam Mayor, I believe that's one for the Executive Manager of Infrastructure who's unwell, but we can have a response ready next week.
Thank you. And the next page, there's about the project being the 2nd and 3rd Avenue drain conversion. I'm just wondering, given the recent workshop, what our next step is with that.
Through you, Madam Mayor, we're intending to bring a report to the December council meeting, seeking, I guess, council's position on further progressing with the project.
But in terms of consultation with the affected community members, we're not doing anything at this stage?
No, we're not, so we'll let them know that it will be considered at the December meeting.
Perfect, thank you. That was it, thank you.
Okay, councillors, any more questions on this item? Okay, we go to 9.7, resolutions of council. Who's going to take this one?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider the processes around the implementation and reporting on previous resolutions of Council. As you can see from the report, there are 2 resolutions from Council, one from 24 years ago and one from 12 years ago, that bring about the need for reports to be presented to Council to enable resolutions to be deleted. The term deleted does not accurately reflect practice and has understandably resulted in confusion as part of the consideration of previous quarterly reports. Staff have reviewed the processes of other local governments and it's recommended that a new process be implemented as broadly set out on page 51 of the agenda. This process is being supported by WALGA and will still allow councillors to have oversight of the implementation of council resolutions, but in a manner that does not risk potential contravention of the Local Government Act. It is therefore recommended that council rescind the 1998 and 2010 resolutions and note the intention to implement a new, more contemporary process.
Questions, councillors? I have some questions on this one. Okay. I have in the past relayed City of Cockburn that publish all their resolutions of council in one site collectively per year. So basically you can go through 2021, all their resolutions of council, 2022, all their resolutions of council. From a transparency point of view, would you perceive that there are some advantages for both councillors, council and the community to have visibility of those resolutions of council in one location on the town's website?
Through you, Madam Mayor, absolutely. And if you look at the last dot point on page 57, that work has already commenced. There is a register on the town's website of council resolutions from July 2016 to April 2022. The reason it stops in April 2022 was that was the transition from to our new doc assembler program. So staff are now working with the software provider to provide an efficient way of exporting data from that system to allow this to be updated. But if nothing else, we have 6 years of resolutions that we didn't previously have, and that provides, as Madam Mayor suggests, really good oversight by councillors, but access to information not just by the community, but by town staff that were the ones drafting reports. And it has been challenging trying to find corporate history, and it has relied on long-serving employees or long-serving councillors to assist. But now that we've got this register, it doesn't go back decades and decades, but it does go back 6 years, which is better than we had previously. And as the report sets out, we will be looking at ways to continually add to that so that in years to come, we will have quite a comprehensive suite of council resolutions.
So the other aspect that's available with the Cockburn site is to do searches based on categories, and I'm wondering if this is something that can be facilitated. I had the experience previously of hunting for a resolution going back to 2017. It took me 2 hours to find it, closing sites, going back to sites. So I'm wondering if we have the ability to look at doing word searches for or category searches.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I've had a play with the Cockburn. I think you've seen that through. That does seem to reflect a very sophisticated system. And without being too pessimistic about it, I'm not sure we would be able to replicate that. That said, the register that we've recently added to the website does absolutely allow word searches. So I do understand that before this register was added, you would have to go into individual agendas and minutes. Thank you, Councillor Amos, for the thumbs up. You had to go into individual agendas and minutes to find what you're looking for. And if you didn't know the exact date, that would be quite difficult and frustrating, I'm sure. But if you go to the register now, as Councillor Amos seems to have done, you can go Control F and do a word search. And if obviously, like any other word search, depending on the word you used, Sandy Beach might come up a few times. But the more specific you are, the easier it will be. But certainly you shouldn't have a repeated 2-hour search with the current register.
So when was this added?
About last week, Madam Mayor.
Okay, and under what? Okay, I was only there last week. Excellent. Okay, so thank you for that. I actually... Can I just ask a question about, okay, I'll experiment with this and I'll send you some questions by email. Sorry, getting very involved in that. Apologies, councillors. Any other questions, councillors? Councillor Polifka.
So I see there's a bit of comment in there about deleted not being the appropriate terminology. In terms of these resolutions, is there a way in which we can signal to the community, perhaps by having 3 different levels, maybe having pending, in progress and completed, so that they can see of the resolutions what has come of them? Maybe if we could implement traffic light style systems, so red, amber, green, to signify each of those levels, green being this has been completed, so people can see that we are actually doing what we say we're going to do.
Through Madam Mayor, certainly that would be the way it is intended to be managed at CMC. Obviously obviously the implementation of council resolutions is a responsibility of the Chief Executive Officer. So the Chief Executive Officer would be managing that via CMC and the directors and executive managers. Putting that information in the public-facing website, we need to consider that, whether it's simply a case of identifying it as complete or whether there'd be an expectation to elaborate on how it was completed.
I wouldn't say
as we refine this system, and as I said before, this only went live a couple of weeks ago, or in the last week, we can certainly look at improving the quality of the information that we provide to community members. Obviously, we would, as you can see in the report to council and recommendation 3, is we would certainly be providing that information to councillors periodically, because council need to probably evaluate the performance of the CEO, need to have oversight of the resolutions of council, so that would occur via the bulletin. But like I say, we need to give it a thought as to how we would run a system that provides for that information to be public facing. It's certainly not adverse to it, we just need to think about how that might work.
Thanks.
If you don't mind, another question. Given that this has only just gone live in the last week and there's still work to be done on it, would you perceive any benefit in perhaps delaying or deferring consideration of this item until councillors have had a chance to see how this develops?
Through Madam Mayor, no, we're not seeing any value in that. They're somewhat different issues. One is the provision of information on the town's website, which is a historical capture of previous decisions. The other is the functions of the CEO in implementing the resolutions of council. So certainly appreciate councils will be eager to use the system and acquaint themselves with the register, but I could not see a reason why the current agenda item would not be considered next Tuesday.
I think the only reason I bring that up is following up from Councillor Polifka, in that this does not show us in clear form what has been completed and what is still current. So I think that's why I asked the question.
And in response, thank you, Madam Mayor, in response to that, that's captured in recommendation 3, and that information will be provided to councillors by the board, so there will be no loss of oversight from a council point of view.
Councillors, Councillor Polifka?
Yeah, just a general question on resolutions, I suppose from a governance perspective. If we can only see back 6 years, any of the sort of lost resolutions that are hiding back in deeper history, do they go stale? I mean, what do we make of those?
Through Madam Mayor, they wouldn't go stale. They would continue to function and operate and be live unless they were otherwise impacted by a subsequent resolution. There is potentially an issue of sort of line of sight to a resolution that may have occurred in 2015, so, and that is a genuine limitation of the system that we currently have. We could potentially mitigate against that. It would be an unbelievably manual task to have someone effectively go retype the resolutions from all the hard copy minute books going back to, say, 2010. That would be an incredibly burdensome task. We can certainly look at how we would best resource that, if that was of interest to councillors. We do have the hard copy minute books on site, so staff do have access to those records. How we would digitalise them, that would be something we need to look into.
No microfilm. And in terms of the, I suppose the fact that we do have resolutions going back 3 months, so practically any decisions we make, we're able to make, because we know what happened 3 months ago, and that would then not have us falling foul of the rule where we can't re-agitate decisions that we've made within the past 3 months without a rescission motion.
Through Madam Mayor, obviously with the newly unregistered, the line of sight of council's decision making goes back to 2016. So council and the community and staff have the benefit of this point back, and we'll obviously work with Harboursoft to find an efficient way to add contemporary resolutions to that register.
So to the extent, though, that we make a resolution in respect of a subject which has been considered by council, say, 10 years ago, and what we're making is contrary to that, that's not a problem, because we're the current council and we are empowered to do so. So there isn't going to be any issues of inconsistency floating out there in the deep past.
Through the matter, there would potentially be instances of inconsistency, but it would almost be a case of you'd have to be aware of the inconsistency for it to be an inconsistency, because councillors might make a decision in 2022 in good faith, having no understanding or no oversight or no visibility of a decision that a previous council might have made in 1990, say, and therefore you might have two resolutions, potentially 40 years apart, that speak against each other. I think in those instances it would be reasonable to assume staff would implement A, the resolution it was aware of, and B, the more contemporary resolution. If staff were aware of a resolution that was going to be contrary to a potential resolution of council, we would certainly bring that to council's attention and recommend that you first rescind it before you add a new recommendation or resolution on that.
Thanks.
Councillors? Okay, we'll move on to 9.8, which is accounts paid for the 31st of October. Are there questions on this item? Okay, we'll move on to 9.9, which is alternative weed control strategies, children's playgrounds. Ms Davies.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report's being brought to council as a result of a council resolution from August, looking at weed management strategies in or near children's playgrounds. So the majority of the report is similar to what was previously provided for the September council meeting, and that item was deferred. So it provides a very comprehensive summary of the current management practices and some of the alternatives and the implications and limitations of some of the alternatives as well. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Councillors, questions?
No, I think we covered this one fairly thoroughly previously. I don't think it's changed from what you were saying, Ms Davies.
Agreed. So no questions?
I have no questions. No.
Okay. Councillor Plivka?
We resolved that issue of the, so in children's playgrounds, I suppose that's easy enough to understand, but the near children's playgrounds, did we arrive at a distance or a way of determining what would be captured by near?
Through you, Madam Mayor, no, there was no specific distance given. We have included some explanation as to buffer zones, and it could apply to the distance from the edge of the play equipment is one example, but there was no specific distance given.
Okay.
No further questions, councillors? The last item is notice of motion 11.1 that I provided. If you'd like to ask questions. However, I am meeting with Ms Davey tomorrow to discuss this notice of motion. So, councillor.
Well, I was just going to seek some comment from the officers about the notice of motion, but if that's not ready to be provided yet.
Through Madam Mayor, the meeting will occur tomorrow and comment will be provided in advance of the OCM next Tuesday.
Councillor Carter.
Oh, it's just a question, if I may. The skips that we order, are they all the same sort that's shown in the photograph? And is there any way of dropping, say, the back down so people can use it as a ramp for a wheelbarrow? Or are people required always to try and lift things over the rim?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we originally they would all be similar to what was shown in the photo. We are looking at options with the door. However, that is also quite heavy to lift up and down, and it can create issues. It becomes stuck as well. but we are looking into that as well.
Thank you. Further questions, councillors? Okay. I think that brings us to the conclusion. So we're at closure, which is at